Hello and welcome to Sustainability. I'm Abby, today's host, and my co-hosts are, please introduce yourselves.
I'm Maddie, and this is my little baby boy, Shark, who's sitting here with me in my studio of my kitchen.
And I'm Karina.
So the tea today is piping, specifically 1.5 degrees. Before we get into anything too crazy, the earth is warming. We're all on the same page there.
Oh, for sure.
What does that mean?
Well, it does kind of depend on what specific aspect of climate change you're looking on, but what it essentially does mean is it's changing. It's getting warmer, which means at some points it gets colder, actually, because of just weird climate things that happen when the shit destabilizes. People call it the new normal. It's not. It's actually quite new even to the history of the world, right? Like it's gone through hot and cold periods, ice ages, warmer periods. This is the amount of the time it's taking to heat up is very, very fast, comparatively speaking to historical things we've seen. So it's not normal. It's very new. And we're going to have to, unfortunately, learn how to deal with that infrastructure wise in the coming decades.
It has been 90 plus degrees, feels like 100 every day for a long time. It's horrible. It's horrible. It's humid, it's hot, and like we don't really get winters anymore. I'm in South Florida. We used to get kind of winters, like in the 50s. We don't even get that anymore.
So it's definitely impacting everyone, and it's new, but I'm going to break it down a little science-wise so our audience just has a background for some of the stuff we're going to get into, even though we're not going to dive into a lot of the hard science of it, but just so they have an idea of what we're talking about. So, super breakdown, the planet Earth, surrounded by various gases, that is our atmosphere. Heat can't easily get out of our atmosphere, which is a good thing. It helps keep us comfortable and habitable as a planet. One of those gases that is talked about a lot is carbon, and there are others, but because we're not going into the science-y thing, carbon's the one that's most talked about in this context. Since the Industrial Revolution, when machines and businesses were taking off, more and more carbon has been released into the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels and things to create energy and such. And because more carbon is being released, more heat is being trapped in our atmosphere, and that's kind of what's leading to this warming. We're going to be tackling this 1.5 degrees Celsius number that is often thrown around in climate conversations. I just want to get an idea of what you guys know or already think about this 1.5 degrees and how it relates to this atmospheric warming.
Well, I come from a marine science background, so I think of climate change in the context of the ocean. The ocean is a huge carbon sink. It's partially how the atmosphere kind of regulates its temperature in the first place because it literally takes in so much carbon that it's really important, and because it's kind of reaching this saturation point with all of this carbon still being taken in.
Yeah, and sorry, can you just go over what a carbon sink is?
Oh yeah, so a carbon sink is basically something that is able to absorb a lot of carbon and hold it. So this is the rainforest you might have heard as a carbon sink because the trees are, photosynthesizing and they're taking in that oxygen, fixing the carbon, and then, releasing more oxygen. But that's essentially what a carbon sink is, and there's lots of them. Bogs are some, peat fields, and the ocean is probably the largest carbon sink on the planet, considering it's 70% of it. I think of it, the 1.5 degrees, as this, it's sort of the mark of, I never want to say no return, but it's things get especially dire there because we're kind of in this place worldwide where the world is kind of teetering on this seesaw where it's either going to land one way or the other. And what we're trying to avoid is kind of turning into this desert scape, like this really hot, not really super habitable, at least for people who don't, have access to things like, air conditioning or, any sort of like way to like keep themselves cool, or if they rely on natural resources. Yeah, I think of it in like it's the marking point that humans have chosen as like, you know, like, oh, it's getting super real. And I just think 1.5 degrees is helpful, but I also think it's kind of like oh, well, we haven't gotten there yet. It kind of stymies progress a little bit, I think.
For me, the 1.5 degrees is, I have a very basic understanding. I don't know any details about it. But for me, 1.5 degrees is like, this is going to sound stupid, but like, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. I barely use Celsius in my everyday life. It just feels abstract to me. I just know it as like, Earth is getting hotter, bad. Once it gets a certain amount of hot, really bad. But I don't know too much about, like, what does 1.5 degrees mean in my real life? I don't really know that yet.
Yeah, and honestly, I have a feeling that a lot of our audience is kind of sitting where you are, Karina. As Maddie mentioned, it's kind of this like tipping point almost that we'll get into in a bit, but I want to do a little TLDR for our listeners in case you can't listen very long. And Karina says she doesn't know what it is in Fahrenheit. It's actually 2.7 degrees in Fahrenheit. But you'll often hear it in Celsius. Well, the rest of the world uses Celsius. America likes to think we're special. Two, a lot of scientific measurements just occur in Celsius. Scientists just use that.
Okay, that makes a little more sense because the difference between 93 degrees and 95 degrees, you could feel that.
So this degree point is commonly used to describe the global average surface warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. So if we're always talking about 1.5 degrees, which Karina is right, it does often feel abstract if you don't know what you're comparing it to. Unless it's specified otherwise, scientists and politicians are comparing it to pre-industrial warming, which is looked at as 1850 to 1900. So none of us were alive then, but during that time frame is used is as an approximation for pre-industrials. Okay, I feel like I've already thrown a lot at you, but are you ready to actually jump in?
Let's get into it.
Oh, we haven't jumped in?
This was like all like the little setup.
Okay. I feel like I should be taking notes.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Okay, so since the 1.5 degrees is being compared to industrial warming, I wanted to give some background since this concept goes back pretty far. So I'm going to set this up as kind of a timeline. We're going to go through a big, long timeline leading from 1850 to present. And along the way, we'll talk about some things. Okay, so we start. Set the stage. 1850 to 1980. I know, pretty far. So since the Industrial Revolution, lots of things happening. Things are changing. Temperatures were rising, but they were rising by about 0.07 degrees between 1880 and 1980. We're seeing the effects of what we're putting out into the atmosphere, and like it's small, but we can see that humans are having some kind of effect. Since more factories are being built, obviously this is going to keep growing over time. And clearly no one's worried about it up to this point.
When do people start using fossil fuels? At this point, they're using some?
I believe so. Which is, burning coal.
Coal, okay.
I'm sure some people are using more sustainable things like the little windmills.
Like hydropower, like dams.
Yeah, I was like, what is that called? I'm like, the little thing on the river in pictures. So I'm sure some places are using that, but at this point, many people are starting to like burn coal and such, and that's why we're starting to see that initial warming. But still, nothing super crazy yet. We get to the 1970s, where people finally start being like, this might not be sustainable. The US economist William Nordhaus claimed as early as 1970, when scientific understanding of climate change was still taking shape at this point. So we're seeing temperature rise, but we're still kind of grasping the concept as a whole. That warming more than 2 degrees Celsius would push global conditions past any point that any human civilization has experienced. And this was kind of the first really big moment that someone had gotten a large amount of attention for speaking out against the increase of warming.
And this was an economist?
Yeah, but at that point they were thinking like 2 degrees Celsius. That's a bit pushing it. No one's ever experienced that before. So then that was 1970. Startings of rumblings. We skip forward to 1987. Clearly a lot was done after that guy spoke.
Immeasurable. We can't even begin to talk about it. Not because it doesn't exist.
So, 1987, President Gayoom of the Maldives gave a speech at the UN about the threat of sea level rise due to climate change. I'm going to read you a quote that he said. He said, man's action over many centuries have transmuted the natural order of his environment to the point where the whole world is ensnared in the consequences. This speech is now kind of commonly known as the death of a nation speech because it focused heavily on the fact that if the warming continued unchecked, as it kind of had been, that it would be the death of the Maldives and small island nations.
Wow. How are they now? Because I know some small island nations are they're getting ready to be underwater.
Yeah, honestly, a lot of this initial push has been from these small island nations that don't have the kind of privilege that we do in the larger US of being places that you can kind of move more inward away from the seas.
Yeah. You'd think that for a nation that really likes to go into these island nations and kind of just exploit all those resources and treat it as like a kind of a vacation spot would care a little bit more, but
Yeah, you'd think.
you'd think.
Mm-hmm.
You'd think.
So then the following year, 1988, this is the year when NASA scientist James E. Hansen held his famous speech to the US Senate proclaiming that global warming had begun.
Wow, okay.
He was actually this was a really big deal. James Hansen still speaks like very openly about climate change, but he essentially in 1988 he told a congressional committee that it was 99% certain that the warming trend was not a natural variation, but was caused by a buildup of carbon dioxide and other artificial gases in the atmosphere. So, even though a year prior the Maldives was like, we will be underwater, he's like, I think global warming has begun. Come on, guys. But at this point, there's honestly not a ton of research, so it's just these like different people coming forward and being like, there's a problem, but there's not like a lot of scientists actively dedicating time to researching this yet, so it's just people kind of like screaming and nothing happening.
This feels like foreshadowing.
2 years forward, 1990. More climate scientists finally weighing in. We're finally here. 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average was the point at which the risk of unpredictable and extensive damage would rapidly increase. So, we're not even to the 1.5 degrees, but they're kind of on the same page that they're like, if we keep going the way we're going, something's not going to go well. 1992, 2 years later. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, which honestly is a whole other thing, and we could probably have a whole other episode on it. But essentially, it was established to stabilize the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere at the level that would prevent dangerous interference with the climate system. So we have this United Nations thing set up to stop climate change. They've done a great job. 3 years later, 1995, there was the first climate summit in Berlin. Countries all over began negotiating a global response to climate change. Okay, are you still with me?
I am. I'm listening, yeah.
To the end of the line, I'm with you.
Okay, skipping forward, 2009. At the Copenhagen's 2009 climate summit, personally, I was not in attendance because I was racing elementary school with my presence. But in 2009, the world still lacked an official temperature goal, and nor had there really been any full scientific assessment on what was considered safe. 2009, all of us are alive at this point.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. No, I've been alive for about, God, how old was I in 2009? This makes me sound old. I'm not, I promise. 1997. 12. I was 12.
So at this point, I feel like I've already seen an inconvenient truth, and that was the first time I was really scared about climate change. So at this point, I was awoken.
Oh yeah, hey, here's a question, and this is a little like, well, how did you guys cope with this kind of thing? Because I had a diary entry that was like, I am so sad about the rainforest possibly being gone in 20 years, and I drew like an alien spaceship coming and abducting the animals to safety. So that's how I was coping. What about you guys? Normal?
Well, I was in Miami, and the documentary said everything you love, everything you've ever seen, your home it's going to be gone, totally gone, 100% gone. So enjoy this while you have it, because it'll be underwater in your lifetime.
I am not sure why. I don't know what my high school science teacher was like thinking, but I have a distinct memory of him being at the front of the class one day and just saying, yeah, this is the one area, this like where we're living, like it's like one of the few areas that like isn't really going to be badly affected by climate change. And I was like, sweet.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, a Miami girl you hadn't met yet is freaking out.
So obviously they weren't thinking about what was a safe temperature. I wasn't thinking about what was a safe temperature. Karina was clearly thinking what was a safe temperature.
I remember like talking to my parents being like, it's going to be a long time. Because what else do you tell a kid? And I was like, I'm going to recycle.
So that's what we were doing. But another thing was brewing with our small island nations. They formed kind of a group called the Alliance of Small Island States. And they, in 2009, actively were urging countries to draw the safe line at 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's really this alliance of small island states that is really pushing hard for this.
You know, I'm so proud of these small island nations. I don't know enough about them, but like, they're doing the work. They've been doing the work before all of us.
Well, that's the thing is like these, like, I mean, if you think about it socioeconomically, these smaller like nations that honestly, grand scheme of things, probably doing the least amount of damage to the environment are going to suffer the most, which is just a sad, disproportionate truth.
Yeah. So only stopping global temperature rise well before 1.5 degrees Celsius would like stop this catastrophe, the group of island nations argued, which is like so clear now. And then Maya Motley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, later put that 2 degrees Celsius would be a death sentence.
Good for her for like telling you how it is.
So this dire insight kind of is what led to the establishment of a temperature target in the UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen 2009. But it's often referred to also as the Failure Summit because even though they kind of got to this goal of like a temperature cutoff, they didn't really super finalize it. And they didn't come up with any plans on how to get to that goal. So they were kind of just like, that kind of sounds good, I guess.
What are they waiting for?
There was nothing like legally binding to pledges that different countries made at that time. So it ended up kind of just being this theoretical pledge that there was nothing really accountable to hold them to. So just for an example, the United States was there and they made a pledge to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 17% below 2005 levels by 2020, and then 42% by 2030 and 83% by 2050.
I don't even want to guess if that happened.
Despite the like kind of theoreticalness and not anything really binding, the US honestly did step up and keep its promise to reduce greenhouse gases by 17% as of 2020 compared to 2005.
I'm pleasantly surprised.
So we can unfortunately thank part of this decline due to the fact that the entire world came to a halt during the global pandemic in 2020. And much of us were not actively using as many emissions. So unfortunately, as we started to enter the world again, so did greenhouse gases. And there started to be an increase of greenhouse gases again, starting in late 2020. So basically, we are not on track for that 42% below 2005 by 2030.
And also, I think it shows us just how unsustainable our current lifestyle is. You know, like we had to be stripped of everything in order to make a difference. And I just wonder how we can. I would love to go back to that and not have people die of a pandemic of a new disease. But I wonder, like, have we gotten used to something that is just so unrealistic for us to continue?
It takes a lot of effort, and I feel like what that kind of shows as well is that a lot of the impetus for change is on the people and not necessarily the governing bodies. Like, as you said, we were shut down, so no one was going anywhere, which means a lot of that was probably just from like production, from like cars,
Travel.
yeah. So what really seems like the issue is that there's not a lot of government impetus to do much.
So we had the 2009 climate summit, and then a little tangent about how we did with our promise. We are at 2010 to 2015. At a summit in Cancun, Mexico in 2010, governments agreed to keep global average temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, while scientists reviewed the proposal for 1.5 degrees Celsius. The review, when published in 2015, found that the concept in which 2 degrees Celsius of warming is considered safe is inadequate. So finally, instead of ignoring the island nations, we were finally like, okay, I guess it would be better if we stuck to 1.5. So the idea that a safe level of warming could be achieved was still kind of subjective. Current levels were already unsafe for those on the sharpest end of like the bell curve of climate change. So like that could be people in specific climate zones or lower socioeconomic status or people of color or just others who are more drastically affected by climate change.
So essentially, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're like, we could do 2 degrees. And then, they did the review and they're like, actually, it's a lot worse than we thought. Like, we can't do 2 degrees.
Yeah. So if 2 degrees is inadequate, what is the difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees?
0.5 degrees.
Can you tell me that? Can you ask me that in Fahrenheit, please? All right, I was a bio major. I haven't dealt with Celsius in a while.
That's okay. I'm going to give you a few examples for the purposes of this moment. They are pretty broad strokes. There are lots of other things that are going to affect the world and society as a whole at 2 degrees compared to what I'm talking about here. So at 2 degrees, 3 times as many people would be regularly exposed to extreme heat.
Compared to 1.5?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
These are all at 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degrees.
Okay.
We would lose twice as many plants and vertebrate species and 3 times as many insects. Marine fisheries catches would decline twice as much.
Can I add something really quick? Sorry, it's just, this happened recently, like this week, the news broke that in Florida, our first species actually went extinct due to climate change and rising sea levels. It is a Key West cactus. I'll Google it and I'll find out. Like, this is like happening right now. And I was so sad because I didn't know Key West. Like, I don't know the Key West, like flora and fauna very well. And to know that I missed out, that's crazy. On this cactus.
So these are like broad stroke, some things that would be worse at 2 degrees compared to 1.5. But although the science on the effects of 1.5 degrees was, at the time, less robust than for 2 degrees Celsius, The review concluded that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would minimize risks compared to a warmer world. And that's not to say that, like, there are no risks at 1.5. It's just kind of stopping it before it gets drastically bad.
Are we prepared for 1.5 degrees?
That's a great question. Before we get into that, we are going to talk about the Paris Agreement, because all of these insights for the past several decades that we've talked about, these are what ultimately led to negotiations that produced the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, which committed countries to, quote, holding the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Do you know anything about the Paris Agreement before we go into it?
Oh, I just know that we were in it. Trump took us out. Biden put us back in. And it's not like how do I put it? I don't know like the right terminology, but you're not going to get punished if you don't follow through.
The Paris Climate Agreement, from my understanding, is a bunch of world nations essentially coming together, acknowledging, like, really truly acknowledging that this is something that needs to be addressed, and each creating their own sort of timeline for addressing it. I think that is sort of like a guideline to guide policy, but I'm not 100% sure if there's any like actual legal ramifications holding them accountable to that. I will say, like, on a more positive note, China is doing really, really well curbing its emissions right now.
Yeah, you guys are absolutely on the right track. The agreement is a legally binding international treaty.
It's legally binding.
It's legally binding.
Oh, I thought it was not. That's good.
But there's, well, just stick with me.
Now, wait a minute.
Okay. Don't excite me like that.
Sorry. I know everyone loves the term legally binding. So the Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate actions carried out by countries. Since 2020, countries have been submitting their national climate action plans, known as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. Each successive NDC is meant to reflect an increasingly higher degree of ambition compared to the previous version. So basically, one round you were like, I'm aiming for this. Next round you're like, I'm aiming higher.
Higher and higher, yeah.
In their NDCs, countries communicate actions that they will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. The goals is basically just like what they're saying their own goal is, because every country is kind of in a different state. So each country is kind of being like, here's how I will do it. It's really nice because it's not like a big blanket thing. It makes you accountable in your own way.
Tailored.
Yeah, it's very tailored.
Well, it makes sense, right? Because different nations don't necessarily have the same level of infrastructure or like...
100%. So countries can also communicate in their NDCs actions they will take to build resilience to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So the Paris Agreement provides a framework for financial, technical, and capacity building support to those countries who need it. And with the Paris Agreement, countries established an Enhanced Transparency Framework, or an ETF. It's a little frustrating to me. This was started in 2015, people. Let's remember that. With the next thing I'm about to say, the Enhanced Transparency Framework, it starts in 2024, this year. Countries will report transparency on actions taken and progress in climate change mitigation adaptation measures, support provided or received. It also provides for international procedures for the review of submitted reports. So basically, no one was really keeping close track to be able to see what other people have done. Not to say that no one was doing what they were supposed to be doing. It was just like, why did it took us almost 10 years to get a transparency framework, which I find a little frustrating, but that's just because I like to know what people are doing. So basically, I said this will start in 2024, but it's really like later in the year, so it's not out yet. I did try to check to see if I could see it. The transparency framework mandates that all parties to the Paris Agreement submit these reports before December 31st. So we'll find out about 2024 in 2025 and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
How dare you want to know what's happening with your government?
Here's a little example of the US and what their aims are currently. Essentially, what the US is trying to do right now is reach 100% pollution free electricity by 2035, invest in a wide array of transportation structures, reducing emissions connected with buildings, support research, development, demonstration, commercialization, and deployment of very low and zero carbon industrial processes and products, support scaling of climate smart agricultural practices, and implement the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act to phase down the use of hydrofluorocarbons. So I think all of this sounds great. I know I said earlier this is legally binding, but Karina was right at the beginning. There are no formal penalties for not meeting these goals. The goal of the no punishment thing, it seems like it's coming from a place of like over optimism. It feels like almost like, oh, we're all in this together. If we're all working really hard, everyone else will keep working really hard. Because like climate change is a global thing and we do all need to work on it. But honestly, I could have a whole ethical debate with myself about like what's better, this like teamwork mentality or like legally binding penalties.
You need someone to enforce some penalties. My schedule is pretty free right now, so I mean.
So this is gonna sound kind of dumb, but I recently played a board game called Daybreak, and it's solving climate change as a board game. And I feel like I'm a climate person. I'm a climate change kind of person, but I feel like I understand it better because like you're all on the same team, you're all different countries, and like you do have things holding you accountable, because if you don't like have enough energy, then your population starve and you get like a penalty here and there and there. And it's a really good game for anyone who wants to understand it more. 'Cause I understand climate change, but now I'm like, I understand from an action perspective a little bit more.
It's like a team sport, right? Yes, the idea is that you don't get any penalties, but the rules are there and they are enforced. We're all in this together, but you gotta play by the rules.
We're so close, guys. 2018. I have now graduated high school.
Yeah, me too.
2018 was like the end of my second year in college.
I graduated high school in 2017. 2018, I was in college.
Yeah, I graduated 2016, but I think I'm Abby's age. I think I'm the same age as Abby.
Okay, a scientific assessment finally confirms what we already know, that the relative advantages of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, in essence, the benefits of halting warming at a lower temperature are always relative to the costs of allowing warming to continue. So basically they're like, guys, we were right. 1.5 degrees.
No way.
So I want to address, though, while we're talking about this, that I feel like a lot of these like policy and big scientific statements address the acceptable limit. The acceptable limit for climate change. And the acceptable limit is kind of what we as humanity collectively decide. Like, we can decide that much lower than 1.5 degrees in change would be best for everyone. But, like, it's kind of at the point where we're like, what are we willing to sacrifice?
Yeah, I know. I was just thinking that, like, not to get too dark, but I was like, whose suffering is acceptable exactly?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Correct. That's kind of it, right? Like, it's whatever's profitable at the moment. That's how our system is set up. The people that kind of push for certain policies to get through are the lobbyists that have money, and the lobbyists that have money right now are, like, the businesses that have historically had money. So a lot of oil companies, some of them are getting into like solar and stuff, but yeah, by and large, corporate interests kind of inform what the policy is.
Yeah. What do you think would be an acceptable limit? What would you personally consider?
3 years ago, 5 years ago. I mean, if we're going to talk about realistically, I would say we can make a choice as human beings to give up a few luxuries. I think a lot of that has to come from, and I'm not a proponent of placing the onus of blame on the citizen, right? Because a lot of this is like a few select corporations, a few select people who are like informing these. So I would say I'm basically putting really severe limitations and not just a slap on the wrist and every 5 years we see if your facility is up to snuff. I think it's like very direct, extreme revolutionary change is necessary. in my opinion. Obviously, that's not realistic, but I think that combined with, if you ask me, would you rather have your Nintendo Switch or, be able to go outside in the summer? I'm going to tell you something. I'd rather go outside in the summer. I won't lie. It's not a hard choice for me. Anyways.
I just keep thinking, like, at this, like, 1.5 degree, that's the quote-unquote acceptable limit. And I just keep thinking, like, at one point, I could be wrong, but, like, at 1.5 degrees, that could be when we decide, like, oh, that's when the poor people suffer. Like, we're okay with that happening. We're okay with poor countries, even if their entire country is suffering. But we can't get past that. That's when we start to suffer,
Well, I think that's kind of it, right? Because there's already coastal communities and other like small communities that are dealing with the effects of climate change. They're already living it.
Yeah, and we're dealing with it. Not we, but, like, people in, like, these countries are dealing with this a lot less privileges than we do. Like, someone was saying it earlier today, like, no AC. My parents are from 2 different countries, and they don't have AC in those countries. And it's funny, I tell them, like, hey, it's so hot, and they're like, I did this with no AC, and I'm like, how? But, with, and, like, my boss is Jamaican. They were telling me, like, a hurricane came through, and they didn't have running water for a year in the 80s. A year. Like, that's insane. And by the way, Jamaica just went through a hurricane right now. Hurricane Beryl. And it's like, and I don't know what kind of infrastructures different countries have, but, like, it's very realistic that some communities are going to have to go through that. They're going to have to go through the same things we go through, but without running water for a year, or without air conditioning, and without just all the resources and privileges that we have to deal with it.
We're fast forwarding 2022. The UN Summit COP27, that's what it's called. Country leaders clinched an agreement to keep the target at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And though they achieved little that would put anyone on track to meet that. So they're kind of like, everyone's coming together. We're like, okay, 1.5 degrees. We're starting to all be chanting it. We're all there. No one is really putting a strong path aside from the initial kind of pledges back in 2009. We've heard this. We know this. We are disappointed by this. 2023. We're so close. This is where we are, guys, basically. 2023, the warmest year on record, with an average increase of 1.48 degrees Celsius.
Oh, shoot. We're right there.
Yeah, we're there, guys. This isn't a far off thing in the future. I know I feel like I was, like, hyping it up, like, oh, so many things. We're thinking about the future. We're there. The data shows that about half of the days throughout the year of 2023 were more than 1.5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial era. And 2 days in November were, for the first time, more than 2 degrees Celsius warmer.
November 23.
Yes,
of 2023. Oh, wow.
So we're there. And that's like an average global temperature.
That's that's like really concerning.
And what's really kind of one of the things that put me over the edge was, like, this fact that was, like, a report from the World Meteorological Organization found that April through to October of 2023 had record high monthly temperatures in the oceans, while July was likely the hottest on land in the last 120,000 years.
I remember going to the beach last July and just being like, the air felt heavy. I remember this so clearly, being under my little tent at the beach and being like, I don't know what we're doing here. Like, this is so bad. But, like, what else do you do when it's hot? You go to the beach, you go to the water and stuff.
Okay, how are you feeling? I'm not trying to lay this all out to scare you. I just think it's really important to fully grasp the gravity of the situation.
I was happier before I do this.
Yeah. So the latest scientific assessments indicate that achieving the 1.5 degrees limit is still technically and economically feasible, but fossil fuels must rapidly be phased out, and CO2 emissions need to be halved by 2030 and reduced to net zero by mid-century. This is a huge and bigger ask than what the US had originally pledged. That we went over. We weren't on our track for our original pledge. I'm not sure how we would reach this.
I did it in the board game.
There is hope. There is hope.
And I do want to say there is right now, the current administration that we're in, 2024, has put out a lot of like executive orders and bills and policies to tackle this. So I don't want anyone to walk away from this feeling like, if you're me, you know, if in going into a depressive fugue, because it's really important to know that you can make a change in your own day-to-day life, even just by like who you support, you know, not even to get political, but to like look at what are the priorities like energy wise for, I don't know, your local representative even. You know, education, like educating yourself and others. It's hard, but you know, there's ways. What I do is like look up good energy news every once in a while, like good environmental news. You know, there's good things like whales have been returning to like the Long Island Sound and the East Coast, dolphins too, sharks as well. Like there are signs that things can get better. It's just a matter of being in that in between state that's scary.
Yeah, and that's kind of where we are right now because so I mentioned that a handful of days in 2023 have hit that 1.5 degree limit. The scientists say that the 1.5 degrees Celsius ceiling can't be considered breached until a string of several years exceed that limit. Most are considering it will be happening at some point in 2030s. And personally, this feels like a little bit of a get out of jail free card for me, but that's just because I want everyone to take drastic action. But we're kind of at that in-between point that you were talking about, how it just kind of is depending on what way we're going to kind of force the pendulum to swing next. I want to kind of wrap us up at the present with kind of this reminder that I read that really stuck with me. And it's that when we talk about these limits, they aren't a hard stop. It's not like it's a hard stop and the world collapses. It's not like we hit it and everyone dies. Which honestly, if you don't understand all the background or like how everything's kind of working in an ecosystem, it might feel that way, which sometimes leads to that climate anxiety. And it's like that kind of frozen in action state. But it really made me think, and it really kind of helped me process and like step back from a lot of my climate anxiety when it was reading, and it was saying that even if we keep taking steps backwards, there's nothing stopping us from kind of changing our direction as a collective and changing our choices to start taking steps forward. So, thoughts. How are you doing? I know that was so kind of a heavy episode to start, but I feel like it's like a really important foundational topic that needs to be understood.
Well, I think it's important because it kind of sets, you know, it sets the stage for every other, because we talk about everything in context of this, right? Like, this is what a lot of our viewers grew up with, you know, like there whatever has been a time where it's like, everything is fine, you know, that's not, really, at least that's not what I grew up with, you know, where like, you know, I grew up, the things I knew about were the ozone layer, which has repaired itself for the most part, by the way, which is a good example of when you cut things and you stop them, the world has a way of fixing itself and balancing itself out, but you do have to give it the help it needs. No, I think this is a really good episode. I think it's important for people to know that, and it doesn't help to bury your head in the sand, and as much as it feels better to do that, but it's important to know about the place that you live, especially when it's the only planet we really have.
I look back at my journey as, you know, a climate-centered person, and I remember being like a teenager and not knowing what I know now and being so stressed all the time. And then that stress doesn't actually encourage you to do things. It encourages you to just flatline, you know? And like, I'll recycle here and there, but I wasn't very active. And then the more you learn, the more involved you are, and the more you're like, okay, I don't have the responsibility to do this all by myself. And for me, that was a really positive thing. And then I started meeting people who, like you guys, who are like-minded, who are doing things. And it just, I really feel like knowing more has benefited my life and my mental health more than not knowing. And in turn, I'm doing a lot more to impact and, a lot more to solve this crisis. And it's going to take millions of people doing that. So
yeah,
that's where my head is at.
I think it's definitely important to like have the information, but also recognize that you don't have to carry it all by yourself.
Exactly. Yeah, that was a beautiful way to just put everything I said in one sentence. That was wonderful.
I want to just end on one kind of question that's like, what advice would you give to some of our listeners who are just kind of starting to think about these concepts and how they can take steps forward?
I mean, my advice will always boil down to be an informed consumer. Know what you're buying, know where you buy it. If you want to, like, if you have the means, the ability, buy local, those are people who are really minimal impact with what they're doing. Get to know your community. Community is good, community is strong, and I feel like there's a lack of that recently, and that's nobody's fault, just a circumstance of the times. Second, vote. Like, and not to be like Hillary Clinton, vote. But like you do need to be doing that, and oftentimes some of the most important elections are the ones like in your county. They're going to be passing like on a really small scale, like these bills that like the executive branch are going to be passing down, right? So it's important to know who's on your ballot, exercise your right as someone who's a part of a democracy. It's one of the few things that still is a democracy about what we're in right now. So do it.
And it's one of the only things that democracy asks of you too.
Literally. And it's, I think that saying it's pointless just shows that you've kind of already given up. And if you're not a quitter and you want to feel like you can make it, that doesn't mean I'm not trying to like disparage, but I am saying like don't throw in the towel before the fight is like before the fight's even begun, I guess.
So I would say to anyone who's learning all this for the first time, take a breath. The world is not going to get better if you're overly stressed, if you're overly anxious to the point of freezing. And go talk to people. There's so many people out there who will inspire you immensely, and use that energy, that inspiration to find your place and what you could do to help the movement. Just by listening to this, you are part of the movement. I've met so many people in my community, and I feel really empowered all the time because I actually know the efforts that are being made to fix this and to combat this. And I'm a lot more optimistic nowadays because of that. I'm still realistic. I still know there are things that need to be done, but I'm actually doing them now, as opposed to when I was 17, 18, and I was just stressed and anxious.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone so much for listening, and for you two to listen to me rant about several decades of information. And if no one else does, we and the rest of our sustainability team thank you for doing your part to cooling down the world. Please join us next time. And in the meantime, check out our Instagram and TikTok, which will have more information on topics we are tackling and maybe some deep dives on things from this episode.
Bye.
So thank you so much.
Bye.